Hey guys, this is Nia. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be doing another flower tutorial. This time we're going to paint yarrows, which is a type of wildflower. The colors can vary, but today I'll be painting yellow ones. So let's begin. First off, before painting, it's always good to draw the shapes in pencil first so you get the idea of the actual shapes. Try to look for references from Google or Pinterest to get the basic understanding on how the plant grows, and try to analyze it a little bit before you draw it out. Yarrows consist of very tiny flowers, so I'm doing small circles to represent the flowers, which will be painted as dots later. The idea is to bunch up the dots without making it too big of a clump, and so that the silhouette is still nice and rounded. What I mean is that it's not square silhouette, it still has to be an organic shape. It would help if you draw out the silhouette first, then fill up the circles as practice. After drawing out the tiny flowers, go ahead and draw the stem, which is nice and long. And as you get to the bunched up tiny flowers, it branches out into tiny little stems at the top. The leaves are also very small, so be sure to get a bit of practice, especially before painting. Just like the flowers, the leaves are also very small, so I simplified it into the shape that I'm drawing now. Just make sure that each leaf is pointing up the stem and not sideways to keep the shape nice and organic. I picked 4 colors for this flower, but as I said earlier, the colors may vary and it's really up to you which ones you're going to pick. Just make sure you swatch it out to make sure you like the palette. What I had in mind when I picked this palette is that since the flowers are going to be yellow, the orange will serve as shadow. The orange will also mute the greens that I use because I plan on making the bottom of the stem a warmer green than the top. If you are unsure of how the paint will mix up, try to also swatch the mixed colors before you start your painting. I've written down the colors that I used in case you want to use the same colors, but I suggest that you just find the palette that you like. Different brands also have different names of the colors, so just pick the ones closest to these ones if you want to paint along. After you're okay with the colors, it is now time to practice with paint. Try to paint as you have drawn it out before. I usually start with the flowers, so load up your brush with the color that you've chosen and just start painting tiny dots. A hint is to make sure the dots are not too far apart and yet not too close either. When the dots are too close, the water will end up making a puddle and the shapes will just look like a blob instead of tiny little flowers that you're trying to suggest. After I use the orange or any color that you have picked for your shadow color, and I paint it randomly around the sides just to create a little bit of definition to the dots. Don't put any shadow on top of the flowers as the light source will most likely be from the top, so try to keep the top yellow or the lightest color. You should see now that the flowers will also look more defined and rounded. Next step is the stem. Here I use the same brush, but it is easier to use a smaller size brush with a very fine tip to do the stems as they can be quite delicate. Always draw from the flowers down to make it much easier for yourself. You can also practice making fine lines to get used to the pressure of the brush before painting the stem on the flowers. What I'm doing now is optional, but here I use the color of the stem with a little bit of yellow and orange to create younger flowers. This just creates variety and you don't have to do this step. Next are the leaves. I suggest using the same brush as you use for the stem for the leaves, but instead of painting just delicate lines, you want to also play with the pressure a bit so the brush goes thick and thin. However, you don't have to be too precise. You can just make sure that the strokes are pointing the right way and it will still look nice. For the bottom of the stem, I used a mixture of orange and yellow-green to create a warmer green. This is also optional. I personally like the look of this. It is just an additional touch. If you are unsure with any of the steps, just repeat it again before you draw the final painting. As in an example here, I repainted the leaves to have a better feeling for my brush pressure because they're such tiny shapes. Just keep practicing until you are comfortable with all the shapes. Another hint is to look out for the composition. As this is a flower that's made out of lots of tiny dots, make sure you're grouping the flowers properly, so when you are doing your final painting, even though there are so many dots touching, be sure to separate the grouping so it's clear. The shadow color should also help with separating the groups of flowers. So that's it. Those are the steps that I use to make the yarrow flowers. I'll paint a larger one as an example. You will see in this example what I mean with the flower grouping, as I bunch up a lot of the flowers together so it looks like they're piled on top of each other. If you want to paint a larger one, I also suggest you use a larger brush just to make it easier on yourself when you paint the dots, because you have to paint according to the scale. I'll use the same steps as I used, and if you want you can paint along to this. I personally don't clean my brush too much between the yellow and the orange color, just so some are a little bit darker than the other and not too uniform. As you can see here, even though the flowers are bunched up and close to each other, they are still separated into their own groups. This is because I form like a circular or an oval silhouette around it and make sure that the dots are within the group that you've assigned it to. It doesn't have to be perfect now. At this step, I'm just assigning the basic placing of where the flowers will be facing and dividing the areas of the flowers in the stem. And as you can see here, I made extra stems outside of the assigned area of the flowers because I didn't feel like the stem was spread out enough. And this is easily adjustable by just adding more dots on top of the stem. You can also decide which grouping you want it to belong to. If you want it to be in the same initial group, use the same color so it blends together, which means just add more yellow and the orange. If, however, you want to create an effect as if the extra flowers are behind the initial group, like what I'm doing here, I just used a more muted color of the actual flowers to separate it from each other. I mute the yellow by adding a little bit of olive green. Another tip when you're painting this flower is to not overcrowd it, because the flowers are formed with tiny little dots. So when you crowd every single area with the elements of the flower, it can look too busy and too chunky, and it'll lose the delicate feel. So keep that in mind while you're painting this. Remember that less is more. And I think the rest are quite self-explanatory from here on. I just used the same exact steps as I did before. Hope you enjoy the rest of the video, and I'll see you at the end. So we are almost done here. I hope you guys learned something new from this video. Let me know if you give this a go and how it went. I'd really love to hear from you. If you have any questions, just leave it in the comment section and I'll try to answer and explain as best as I can. Hope you guys enjoyed this video and have a great rest of the day or night depending where you are from, and I'll see you at the next video. Bye!